another Times Radio Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm one of the presenters of Times Radio Frontline, former senior British military intelligence officer and commentator on all matters geopolitics, defence, cyber, terrorism and anything else that people ask me to do. Number of videos for you to watch this week. I'd say go to the channel and watch all of them. And of course you can get us on podcasts now, so go to your favourite podcast channel and search for Times Radio Frontline and you can listen to us if you don't want to watch. But the first video this week that I want you to have a quick look at is Donald Trump. I think it's around his cabinet table and he's talking about what he thinks of Vladimir Putin.
We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. And a lot of them are his soldiers and their soldiers, mostly. And it's now up to 7,000 a week. And I'm not happy with Putin.
And of course, there's been another interview with Donald Trump on Air Force One saying similar things.
I told you I was very unhappy with my call with President Putin. And it just seems like he wants to go all the way and just keep killing people. No good. It's not good. I wasn't happy with it.
So what has he been saying about Putin? Well, he says he's not happy with Putin. And interestingly, Donald Trump puts a figure on the number of people that are dying or being impacted. He says 7,000 a week Putin is losing. He accuses him of putting his own soldiers on the line. And he says there's a lot of Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers that are being killed. And he puts this figure of 7,000 a week. Now 7,000 ties in with the approximate 1,000 a day that Russia is losing on the front lines. But the interesting thing is not just from the way Trump says, I'm not happy with Putin, but if you look at his body language as he's saying it, it's quite clear that he is angry and he's genuinely not happy at Putin. So this isn't Trump just coming out with a saying. I think Trump thought that he could control Putin and he's now realizing that he can't. What his next move is going to be will be interesting. The next video that I want to highlight to you is Francois Macron, the French president, on his visit to London, turning around and talking about the importance of support for Ukraine.
The United Kingdom and France must once again show the world that our alliance can make all the difference. Clearly, we have to work together in order to defend an efficient multilateralism and to protect the international order as we forged it after the Second World War.
So in this video, as you've heard, Francois Macron emphasizes the importance of providing Ukraine the support for as long as it takes, and for France and the UK to work together, but not just France and the UK, France, the UK and the coalition of the willing. Of course, this ties in with the French president's visit to the UK this week on a state visit. And when we're recording this on Thursday, he's with Keir Starmer in number 10 Downing Street, having some bilateral talks, but they're then going into a video conference with this coalition of the willing, the world leaders that are continuing to support Ukraine. The United States is still on the supporting list, but what is quite clear from what Macron is saying, what Starmer is saying, and what the German Chancellor Merz is saying is that there's greater support coming out of the EU. And a lot of this ties in with the increasing defence budgets that came out of the last NATO summit that happened only a couple of weeks ago. So into the two videos that I want to point you at this week. Again, everything that we've done this week interview-wise is fantastic. The first one is with John Luff, and John is with the New Eurasian Strategy Centre. And John is going into talking about how there are oligarchs that seem to be dying.
We've seen a string of people falling off balconies and out of windows and other things. But the case of Roman Starovoyt, the Minister of Transport up until yesterday, is very significant because it's actually connected to Ukraine. Because between 2018 and 2024, he was the governor of Kursk region, which last summer was invaded by Ukraine in a surprise attack. And the defenses, which had supposedly been fortifications that had been put in place in Kursk region after the start of the war, proved to be absent. And naturally, an investigation on the Russian side began into why money allocated for the purposes of building fortifications had had not been invested properly and had probably gone into bureaucrats' pockets or into other things. So the governor who replaced Starovoit, he is in jail at the moment on some corruption charges, and I suspect something similar was coming the way of Starovoit himself. So did he commit suicide? We just don't know. But he was probably looking at a potentially quite lengthy jail term if he'd been found guilty. And the way the Russian court system works, if you're charged with an offence like that as an official, there's probably a pretty good chance you're going to end up behind bars. And there's a case certainly of one Russian general recently who received, I think, a 13-year jail sentence on some embezzlement charges, and as somebody who was in fact a hero of Russia, had that sort of status in the armed forces, and yet they're not immune to this sort of investigation. So I think in Starovoit's case, that probably explains what the nature of the problem was. But for somebody to receive the news they've been fired as transportation minister, and obviously criminal charges piling up, it was unexpected that he should die in this way.
And as you mentioned there, it's not the only suspicious death of a quite high-ranking person in the Russian elite. Earlier this week as well, Andrei Badalov, vice president of Transneft, which is an oil company largely owned by the Russian government, he was found dead after a fall from a building he lived in. It's not known how this happened, but when and why do Russian oil executives and the like tend to die under these sort of suspicious circumstances?
It's a bizarre situation, and it's very difficult to offer an explanation here beyond the fact that this is a dirty business, and Badalov was working for Transneft, which operates the pipeline system, in fact, in the country, and therefore is responsible for quotas of oil, which are then exported. And I don't know to what extent he might have been caught up in some form of illegal business. It's perfectly possible, although he appeared to be, from the accounts I read, responsible for modernizing digital systems in the company. It didn't seem to be handing out quotas directly. So who knows whether it was a signal to somebody he was allied with, but the death most certainly looks suspicious. And you're right. There have been other senior executives from I think Gazprom's, from some other Russian companies who've also, over the last 3 years, died in mysterious circumstances, and not just in Russia, by the way. There was certainly one family that died in Spain, I believe. And the assumption there is that the Russian executive, the father in his family, had shot his wife and children and then turned a gun on himself. But I simply don't have the information to be able to judge what might be going on here. But all one can observe is that there seems to be a very relatively large proportion of people dying in suspicious circumstances, and that suggests that all is not well in that domain.
And elsewhere, just yesterday, gold tycoon Konstantin Strukov was banned from leaving Russia and purportedly had his assets seized by the FSB. Strukov was very much, from what I've read, an ally of Putin. How has he ended up seemingly on the wrong side of the Kremlin, do you think?
Very hard, again, to know the precise reason for this, but he had acquired this gold company on the cheap when it went bankrupt some decades ago, I believe, then built it up and became, in his own right, pretty wealthy. One account I read suggested that he was worth, personally had wealth of about a couple of $billion, which is, really quite significant here by Russian standards. And it may just be that somebody had decided that he'd profited enough from that business, he'd done well enough, and that he needed to share the proceeds elsewhere. That's very often the case in these states that have strong mafia elements to them. So it rather feels though he might have got caught up in something like that. You're absolutely right. He was perceived as an ally of the Kremlin. He was in fact sanctioned by the UK I believe after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, just over 3 years ago. And he was also a member of a regional assembly and part of the United Russia Party, the Kremlin's political party, if one can call it that, a political movement. So he, in many ways, seemed to be, on side with the authorities. But when we talk about the authorities, there are different groups within them, competing interests, and the Kremlin is not always in a position to referee these competitions that take place between business people and business groups, and it's quite likely that he again got caught up in something that just sort of spiraled out of control, and then he's suddenly another statistic.
And I think this is in the back of what's happened this week, where the former Russian transport minister and oligarch Roman Starovit, after having been sacked by Vladimir Putin, was found dead in his car only a few hours later, having shot himself and committed suicide. Over the last couple of years, there have been dozens of Russian oligarchs or senior individuals who have died in mysterious circumstances. They have either fallen out of windows, which tends to be very popular, or they have fallen down stairs. Some have fallen off the back of their boats. Others have just been shot dead and assassinated. At the moment, there's suggestions that this could be Putin starting a clear out of those dissenters that he has. However, it seems to be that every time Putin comes across someone that has embarrassed the wider network that he controls, that individual disappears, or at an individual who turns around and raises a question about what Vladimir Putin is doing and questions the way he's going forward, then Putin's approach is to have him removed. That means that Putin will maintain loyalty from the rest of his oligarchs, whether they want to be loyal to him or not. I think a lot of them value living more than criticising. And the final video I want to point you out this week is from David Debato. This is the first time we've chatted with David on Times Radio Frontline, and he's a former US military counterintelligence officer, and he writes now for the Kyiv Post, and he podcasts, and on the video we give you the details of his channel where you can go and see what he's doing everything about. And he's talking about the challenges that Ukraine is having from a tactical perspective in the east, and the fact that they're working very hard, but giving up territory. But as they give up territory in a few hundred meters, the cost that is to the Russians in thousands of troops dying for a few hundred meters of territory is something that the Ukrainians are actually planning. They're trading space for time, and they're trading space for casualties, and they're causing huge numbers of casualties.
Well, I communicate with as many Ukrainians as I can on a daily basis, whether it's through email, text, whatever. So I do have a sense of what's going on there. And no, it's not working at all. In fact, just very, very briefly, air campaigns like this meant to pound the civilian population into submission never work. They didn't work in World War II. They didn't work with the fanatics in Germany. They certainly didn't work in Japan when we firebombed Tokyo. They were more fanatic than ever. They didn't work in Vietnam with the Americans, and they're not going to work now. In fact, the opposite is happening. The Ukrainians, with very, very rare exceptions, are more hardened to Russia right now, have more visceral hatred towards Russians right now than they ever did going back to 2014. So it's having the exact opposite effect. So no, if anything, Putin has given the Ukrainians even more of a reason to fight against Russian forces.
Do you think that that's going to make it easier for President Zelensky to recruit more people into the military? Because the one thing that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are really suffering from here is people, and it's not just getting the raw people into the military and onto the front line. It's getting them through the training that they're needed to get in the front line. At least the Ukrainians give their civilians a degree of military training before they put them into formed units, whereas the Russians just seem to press gang people, put an AK-47 or equivalent into their hands, and chuck them into the meat grinder.
Well, as everyone knows, Russia outnumbers Ukraine about 3-1. And this is a critical difference. Look, one of the main criticisms that I and many military and intelligence professionals have had about Ukraine since the beginning is that they do not have a conscription policy that allows them to conscript men under the age of 25. I understand that. And I know why President Zelensky doesn't want to do that. I think it's wrong. In the beginning, perhaps it was a good policy. Right now, they can't afford it. There's been several articles written recently about the old men, meaning men from 45 to 70, that have been on the front lines for 3 years for Ukraine because either they don't have enough men or they want to spare the young men so they can raise families and so forth. And yes, many Ukrainian men have left Ukraine because they don't want to go to the front lines. But again, these are the exceptions. Here's the thing. Do they have enough people in their military right now? No, they don't. They need more. In order to gain the numbers that they need, short of drastic draconian measures, they need to change their conscription age. They need to make it down to 18. Every other Western country that has conscription, including the United, well, we don't have conscription, but we have an age of 18, 17 with a parent's permission in the United States to join the military. They need to get it down to at least, I would say, 19 or 20 in Ukraine in order to get the kinds of numbers that they're going to need, no matter what kind of weapons are supplied to them. So that needs to change, and it needs to change right away.
Well, the troops are used in the front line, and your recent reports indicate that there's a deteriorating situation on the front line. Now, as commentators, a lot of commentators are very good at measuring the success or failure of the war by how many tens of meters the front line moves, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the Chasiv Yar Pokrovsk front is the bit that seems to be collapsing. Is probably too strong a word, but putting pressure on the Ukrainian defenders. From a wider military intelligence perspective, how long do you think the Ukrainian defenders can realistically hold this line? And do you think there'd be strategic consequences if the Russians actually manage to break through in this area or any of the areas?
How long will the Ukrainians hold this line? As long as they need to. And I really mean that. I really mean that. One of the things that are not discussed enough, including some of your brilliant guests who really are much better than I am at analyzing tactics and strategy, one of the things that are not talked about enough is the emotions, the morale of the troops. Ukraine, as you've said often, they're defending their homes, their country, their families. This is an existential battle for them. That means a whole hell of a lot. So I guess to answer your question, how long will they be able to hold the line around Pokrovsk and some of these other areas? As long as they need to. And yes, they're outnumbered, but what they're doing tactically, of course, it's brilliant. They're letting the Russians throw themselves into the meat grinder at 1,000+ per day of either deaths or casualties. They don't allow themselves to be surrounded. Just when they pull back. And the Russians leave 10,000, 20,000, 15,000 dead and wounded in that small area, and they gain 100 meters, 200 meters, whatever. The Ukrainians regroup a little further back, and they do this again and again and again. They can do this for years. And eventually even the Russians will run out of troops for every dead Russian and North Korean and maybe even Chinese troops. So they can do it as long as they need to. By the way, just really quickly, Aravika, I think, is one of the small villages that has changed hands many times. And forgive me, I have to just say this. I always think of, because I'm sorry, I'm an old musical theater fan. I always think of Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. This was the name of their village and a great song. So, and it was actually in Ukraine. It was based on a real story. So I think the Ukrainians will defend Anatevka to the last Russian.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. And it's great that you mention this, the resolve that they've got, the Ukrainians, because they're defending their homeland. We forget very often the moral component of fighting power. People will compare tank for tank and aircraft for aircraft and numbers of troops for numbers of troops. But actually, you add in that moral component, and that's the thing that gets the big change. But it's for commentators, you can't produce a nice graphic that shows that on a TV screen or anywhere else.
Well, and Philip, how many articles have there been recently in pundits that have talked about the lack of morale with the Russian troops for many reasons? They don't know what they're fighting for. They don't have any morale. And when they learn that they're really just fighting for Putin's ego, thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, have deserted. That's huge. That's really huge. And it's the exact opposite with the Ukrainian forces.
So that's the recap for this week. Thank you very much indeed. Look forward to talking to you again next week. Goodbye.